Hello, friends. I'm Alan Fadling, and you're listening to the Unhurried Living podcast, where we inspire you to rest deeper, live fuller, and lead better. Today, I'll be talking with Curt Thompson about his most recent book, The Deepest Place: Suffering and the Formation of Hope. In it, he shares practical wisdom for how God can make our places of suffering a place where resilience is formed, character is enriched, and hope is deepened. Welcome to a transformative conversation on the neuroscience of suffering, how connection transforms pain. In this episode, I'm joined by Curt Thompson, psychiatrist and author of The Deepest Place, as we journey into the science of connection and the mystery of resilience. What if our greatest pains weren't meant to be carried alone? Thompson explores how our brains are wired not just to endure suffering, but to find healing through meaningful relationship. Together, we'll explore the profound ways connection rewires our minds, opens our hearts, and invites us into a fuller, more compassionate understanding of ourselves and others. Curt Thompson is a respected psychiatrist, author, and speaker with expertise in interpersonal neurobiology. He's known for blending science and spirituality and is passionate about helping people navigate suffering, resilience, and authentic connection. His books, including The Soul of Shame and the book in focus today, The Deepest Place, help us understand how the brain is shaped by our experiences and relationships, guiding us to cultivate deeper emotional and spiritual lives. Through his work, Thompson invites us to embrace vulnerability as a path to wholeness, empowering us to transform pain into connection and healing. He is the founder of Being Known, an organization dedicated to personal and relational growth. Now, let's dive into my conversation with Curt Thompson. Well, Curt, what a treat to be able to have this visit, and I really look forward to talking about this book of yours, The Deepest Place.
Alan, it's always really good to see you, and it's been too long, but I'm glad that the book has been an occasion to bring us together. This is great. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of it.
Absolutely. I am too. I would love to start our conversation asking if you could share a little bit of how it is this particular book came to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know how intentional, how non-conscious the progression of the different books has been, moving from one book to the next, to the next, to the next. I think the first three that I wrote do tend to form a bit of a three-part arc. And then this book, I still see the moment, and I write about this particular person in the book. There was a moment where this book kind of crystallized, and there is a character in the book who exclaims at one point that she just can't keep doing this work that she had been doing for 25 years. And, for our listeners, we would say, like, it's the work of living. It's, it's not, it is not some particular work of something that is particularly harsh about her suffering. There were things that were harsh about her suffering, but I think, I tell people, look, I think the more seriously we follow Jesus, the more we will make contact with real suffering. Because I think if we give him access to parts of us, he's going to want access to things that we don't want to give him. And in fact, things that we might not even know that are there. And the reason that we don't is because we've worked really effectively to make sure he never finds out about them. Yeah. And then I think that he, as he does that, he is going to further ask for us to be more generous, ask for us to be more effective and more active peacemakers. If I'm going to be increasingly more and more and more a living, breathing, pulsating Sermon on the Mount, I have work to do, and it's not going to be there are going to be parts of that work that I'm not going to want to do, frankly. Pray for my enemy. well, that would presume that I'd actually have to go and make a list of the people who are, and I don't have any enemies until I actually take that seriously. And then it's like, oh, yeah, like last year I had to start to make a list of people that I haven't forgiven and that I've actually had a pretty good time resenting. Like I've kind of enjoyed like holding on to my resentment. And like, who wants to admit this? But well, there you go. You are. And then you think like, gosh, to actually wade into that requires a certain degree of suffering, because it's like the suffering of giving up your addiction. It's the suffering of getting up off the couch when you've been on the couch for 5 years and you want to get in shape. And you're like, the first 3 miles are going to be hell.
Yeah.
And the whole thing that we say, and this particular woman, was when she exclaimed that, I can't keep doing this. I had come at a time when, I tell folks, we all, at least I tend to think that if people get old enough eventually, that they're going to stop behaving badly. They're just kind of like somehow wear out of their ability to behave badly. Like, the reality is that there are certain people whose parents are now aging into their like late 70s, 80s, 90s, and they continue to have the energy to behave really badly. And you think, well, like, she's 88 years old. Like, I can't actually ask her to make changes. Well, my goodness, like, Moses got the call at age 80, and like the dude was going to have to make changes. Abraham gets the call at 75. He's going to have to make changes. And God doesn't seem to be apologizing for the fact that he's calling people who are about to die. Like, you got to make changes. And her parents weren't making changes, and her parents were continuing to behave badly, into their, 80s and 90s. And it really struck me that, we can talk about the stuff we talked about in Anatomy of the Soul. We can talk about shame and all of its implications, which come in the book that came out. We can talk about what it means for us to create beauty and goodness in the world. This is what we're really called to do. And we can do all of that. And at the end of the day, if we're taking all of that seriously, we also have to acknowledge that we are going to be people who suffer. And I think that I live in a world in which I think I shouldn't have to. Like, why else would I want to buy a book other than to read the book that'll tell me how I won't have to suffer anymore? Like, why spend that money?
Yeah.
And so that was this place of like, oh my goodness, we it's Jesus saying in John 16:33, in this world, like, you're going to suffer, you're going to have tribulation, there's going to be trouble. I'm like, well, great, thanks for that encouragement. But then he has the audacity to say, but be of good cheer. Like, okay, let me try to get my hands around this. First of all, you're telling me I'm going to suffer, as if like this, like now we should have a party about this. And because he says, be of good cheer, for I've overcome the world. And I think when he says that I've overcome the world, there is this thing like when Paul talks about this notion in Romans 5, it felt to me like this text is pulling a curtain back on this patient's life, that what enables her to continue to do the work in which she will suffer because she's following Jesus while everybody else around her is running in the other direction, all of whom, of course, would call themselves Christians. She's following the King, and there is a withering effect that it has, because you want to follow Jesus, and people who call themselves Christians are going to treat you like you're you're mad.
Yeah.
Because you want to say the things that are true about what's happened in your family, or what's hard about what's happening, or you want to no longer, like, you actually want to Sabbath in the way that we're supposed to Sabbath, or you want to no longer gossip, or you want to no longer be a person of violence, because you stop talking about things, and you won't talk about things when your parents are talking about things, and you leave the room. They're all the things we have to do.
All that. And
then your parents say, in their 90s, like, why do you have to be so you? And she feels like she's 13 years old all over again.
Oh, gosh.
So anyway, it's for her and for everybody else who I think is serious about following Jesus, for whom it's really important we acknowledge that we suffer. Jesus did. You're going to have tribulation.
Yeah.
And I'm coming with you. I'm going to be right in the middle of it. I'm not afraid of it. I'm not worried about you. We're going to be fine.
Yeah. That's amazing. I'm so grateful for the gift of that reflection and the writing you've done. as I've had the treat of traveling the world and interacting with Christian leaders in other cultures, African cultures, I think of India, suffering is just part of life. There's no big shock. There's no sense of entitlement like you described that, if I follow Jesus, life should go swimmingly and I should never have a trouble in the world. But my brothers and sisters in other parts of the world seem to understand that what you just said. In fact, as I was reading, you talk about that Jesus invites us to cultivate a capacity for a sort of hospitality toward our suffering, which is a very different take or approach to suffering than most of us are familiar with. Right. Can you say more about that idea, especially that hospitality toward our suffering?
Well, it's this very day, and the last day in October, 2024. This morning, I was in Matthew's text in the 8th chapter and the 17th verse, and you read this and you just read it and you read it like, oh yeah, I read it. You don't notice. You know how this is. There are days when something jumps off the page, just taps you on the shoulder in ways that. And in fact, I'm gonna, because I can get it. My Bible is right here. I'm gonna read this text in the NRSV, and it says this. It says after Jesus has been in the home of Peter and heals Peter's mother-in-law, and then he goes on to heal many people, and this was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took our infirmities and bore our diseases. This is Isaiah speaking. He took our infirmities and bore our diseases. And, I have to say, Alan, when I imagine Jesus healing, like I'm a fan of The Chosen, right? I watch this and you see Jesus with a leper or you see Jesus with whoever. And you have this sense that Jesus touches the leper and the leprosy, or he heals the demoniac, and whatever it was that was bad just kind of like vaporizes into thin air. And there's Jesus, and there's the leper, and whatever was going on with the leprosy, like it somehow just like disappears.
Mm-hmm.
But that text hit me today in a very different way, because I read the text and I'm hearing that Jesus is like taking it, right? He receives our infirmities and he bears these things. It's kind of like I am a living, breathing disease process, and the Holy Trinity is a house that's throwing a party. Me, the leper, I don't just have leprosy, like I am leprosy. And Jesus is the host, and we get it. He said, "Here, let me take your coat." This sense that he receives it, he is hospitable to it, he's absorbing it. I've always imagined a king who just somehow magically makes it go away for everybody, himself included.
Yeah.
The whole notion that he's carrying it, that he holds it, that Good Friday was a place where Jesus held. And I think this is the thing that when Paul goes on to write about how we share in Christ's sufferings.
Yes.
I'm not just sharing in the thing itself. I am being Jesus to the world, and I am receiving. I am holding. And in my suffering is a thing that I receive as to create liberation for the person who's giving it to me.
Yeah.
And I then I lock arms with Jesus to do what he does. And I think of the people who've done that for me. And I think that, when we, in the book, when we talk about these confessional communities, I think what we're trying to do is to create a community that itself receives, that holds, bears. I help to shepherd a particular confessional community in which right now they're working really hard because these are people who've been together for for about 3 years now, and they have done all the work of sharing all the things about outside their lives, outside the group, and now they're having to work through a rupture that has happened within the group.
Oh.
And you say, look, if sooner or later, like I'm bringing my leprosy into the church, and at some point somebody else is going to catch it. Like I bring my anger, I bring my unfinished business into the church, and somebody else is going to catch my anger. Somebody else, this is why this is why there are so many sick people in a hospital. Oddly enough, and so I think that this notion of like, who would on purpose build their house and say, yeah, let's bring all the sick people here. But that's what hospitals do, and I think that's what our churches are meant to be. In part, they are meant to be places that do this very thing. What Matthew's writing that Jesus does, and it's hard, and I can't do that unless I have done the hard work of allowing myself to go to the places where I suffer, and then allow someone else to be hospitable to that, which of course is an act of great vulnerability.
Oh my.
Yeah.
It is.
I mean, what if I get there and they say, no, you are just way too unclean?
Yeah. And of course, the challenge is that some people have responded to my wounds or my brokenness or my place of struggle in that very way.
Yeah.
They have not been a presence of grace. They have not found grace in their own places of need.
Yeah.
And therefore haven't any to pass along me. That image of sharing in the fellowship of his suffering. I've sometimes imagined, there's some theological meaning related to the cross, and it's mostly theoretical, and I'm supposed to believe it, I guess. But fellowship, that's sharing, that's interactive, that's ongoing. It's not just a moment in time. And that's what I hear you saying, that that there's this sense of Jesus invites us into a sort of communion we never imagined he wanted to have with us.
Yeah. And you use that word imagined. I think that's a really important word in that our unrepaired ruptures not only impair my ability, they don't just wound me, but they also impair my capacity to imagine that my wounds could be anything other than what they are. So you're absolutely right. It interferes with my imagination, with my capacity to imagine out beyond where I happen to be. And so, I end up telling the story that I have to tell in order for me to cope in the world, which includes things like, as we mentioned in the book, which includes, if I'm going to be okay with God, then I'm going to have to make sure that everything is okay, because I know that there are parts of me that are still at war with him, or he's still at war with me. I don't really, whatever that justification language is supposed to mean, I can't even imagine the notion that someone is hospitably inviting me into the house, because I know that there are parts of me that still believe that God's at war with me and I'm at war with God. Imagining what it means to be the object of God's pleasure. I can't do that. It's really hard. Yeah, theologically maybe, but in my chest, how am I going to know that? Well, the way that I come to know it, as it turns out, is if I see it in you. That's the way that I see it. That's the way that I see it. And if I don't see it in you, I will continue to have parts of me that are afraid of the thing that I most deeply long for at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in that chapter where you unpacked Paul's line about justified by faith, you imagine Jesus saying something like, all those things that we both know keep you from receiving my love for you, I'm not paying attention to them. I'm paying attention to you. That was a real gift for me to read. I wonder if you can say more about that. What's Jesus giving attention to when he looks at us?
Well, it's funny in the book, The Shack.
Yeah.
Right. There's for our listeners who have ever read this book. There's a conversation that Jesus is having with the protagonist, Mac, in the book. They're having a conversation out on a dock. And Jesus says to him something like, the thing with you humans is that whenever you imagine your future, you never imagine me being in it. And Alan, I read that line and I'm thinking like, man, no kidding. This whole sense of imagining Jesus wanting me to pay attention to him paying attention to me, when all I can imagine, like I don't imagine that Jesus who just wants to be in the room with me. I imagine the Jesus who's like looking at all of the things that I've not done or that I've done or whatever. And in fact, that's where I'm drawing my attention. I'm turning my attention. And so, one of the acts that requires effort on our part, and God requires, like he is a demanding God in the sense that he wants real human beings. He wants real partnership. He wants real cooperation. He doesn't want to wave a wand and just magically turn us into puppets, right? He wants us to take responsibility for what we've been made to become, kings and queens on the earth. And he wants me to pay attention to him paying attention to me. That's not easy for me to do. I am forever, my attention is forever wanting to say, but have you? But I know that you're going to, all the things that are in my peripheral vision, where he keeps saying, look at me. Look at me. Do I look like somebody who's really interested in paying attention to all the problems that you've had, all of your, do I sound like I'm a person who's paying attention to this?
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, but, and then I draw his attention back, to the very thing.
Yeah.
And there is a certain sense in which, someone said that I remembered recently, without God, we can't do it. And without us, he won't do it, whatever the it is. And there is this sense in which when Paul says, work out your salvation, this this is a significant part of what that means. I have to do the work of paying attention to him, paying attention to me. Yeah. And he's not going to make me do that. And therein lies some of the work, right? I mean, it's even, we talk at length about how justified by faith has to do with attachment and how God comes to us with loving kindness, that he was coming for Adam, not to kill him, but to have a conversation. Where are you? Adam's misinterpreting this. Adam's reading this in a very, very different way. And, we would like to say, well, why didn't God just really get his attention? Why didn't he just yell at him? Hey, come back here. Come out of the woods. Why didn't he just do that? Because God's taking us seriously, far more seriously than we take ourselves. And so that sense of my needing to pay attention to Jesus, paying attention to me, requires practice. It requires effort. And if I don't have a community with whom I can sit, whose real faces, whose real bodies I can gaze upon as they gaze upon me, it's difficult for me to make these things up. Now I can watch The Chosen, and I can imagine Jonathan Rumi and me being in the room together, and that's a good thing to do. I tell people I now I guess I realize I'm now praying to Jonathan Rumi. Anytime I have my quiet time, I hope he's okay with that. But at the same time, then when you walk into a real room with real human people, Am I able to envision? Am I able to do the work with embodied bone and blood there in the room? And we come to find out, I thought, look, you can't, if you've had a really bad swimming accident when you're a little kid and you're like, I'm just not getting back in the pool, you can't learn to swim by like watching a YouTube video.
No.
By watching other people swim. At some point you have to stick your toe in the pool and then your ankle and your leg and all of you and so forth. And I think that this is where community makes a difference because it can lead toward our having a full-bodied experience of those other things that we talk about that Paul's exploring in the text.
Yeah. So I love that invitation to pay attention to how it is that Jesus is paying attention to me. You said in the book that the story of Scripture tells us that Jesus has not just come to make peace, but rather that he himself is that very peace. And that was something that I learned in the writing of my last book, A Non-Anxious Life. It was, I realized my own anxiety had habituated me to envisioning a future without Jesus much involved.
Dude, I'm telling you, like you're like in my diary.
Oh man.
Yeah.
And I've had to rehearse in all the ways I can imagine doing it, that I'm living my life in the presence of a Prince of Peace. How will that touch my anxious heart and anxious mind and anxious body to be in communion with such a Savior? Yeah. So can you say more maybe from your experience about this sort of relational and very personal nature of peace as it relates to Jesus?
Yeah. Well, I'll give an example. In our practice, we run these groups called confessional communities, and we talked about that in the book, in a previous book. And this past week, in one of those groups, there was a rupture. That didn't just happen like in that particular day. It's been a series of small ruptures that in some respects a number of people have participated in, but nobody's really naming until somebody spoke up and said, I just want to name that this has been happening in the room. And it's hurt my feelings. And this person started to name names, right? We're not going to say like, oh, I'm feeling hurt by the group. Yeah. This person like turned to the person beside them and said, when you X, Y, and Z, I feel left and hurt. Now this person, now this is a group that's working at like, how do we deliver these things, right? This person is not saying to the person sitting beside them, you're a jerk. Yeah. They're not right. They're learning how to say like, I'm angry and sinning not. They're talking about themselves. Okay. So this is just the beginning of what becomes an almost 90-minute conversation among all the members of this community. And, before you know it, it's drawn in everybody, and everybody has a stake in this game. Everybody's a participant. Everybody has behaved in some way, shape, or form that has contributed to this. But it's not until somebody names it explicitly. And sometimes we have to kind of work our way up to naming these things, but name things explicitly with real people. We're no longer talking about some abstract idea like some people have hurt my feelings. No, we're naming names, but we're not naming names with violence. We're not saying the woman you gave me. We're not doing that. We're saying when you did this, I felt thus and such. I'm not, this is not an indictment. I just want to tell you like what my experience has been. Now, you can feel the tension in the room, and you can feel everybody, they start to move in their seats. You sense the body tensing until the person who's received this says, I really hear you. And you're right. And I'm sorry. And then you hear like this kind of corporate exhale, but then other people start to get involved, and then people start to chime in and say, And I know that I've also contributed to that. There's things that I could have done differently, and I didn't do that very well. And I'm really sorry that. And so it leads to this corporate work of repairing a rupture that was not like a clean, like knife, like when you slice your finger and it's just very neat. It's more like a gash that is jagged. And it has to, we're going to have to take our time and like put this back together carefully. And right. And it's not just going to take three stitches and you're done. And getting to your question, these are people who've come into this space believing certain things to be true about themselves. One of those things being, my presence doesn't really matter that much.
Yeah.
And at first glance, you start to hear, that it looks like when somebody starts to name what feels like a rupture, it starts to feel like they are, being critical or condemn or whatever, accusing the person when really they're talking about themselves. And what they're really talking about with the person with whom the rupture is like, I want more of you. I want to be more connected to you. I want more with you. I'm not here to tell you you're a jerk. I'm here to tell you I have seen the parts of you that are not, and I've seen the parts of you that are having a hard time that create the thing that works. And I want more of you. I will tell you, Alan, my colleague and I, when that session was over, we looked at each other and we thought, you can't make this stuff up. These are followers of Jesus who are doing the work of reconciliation. They're doing the work of forgiveness. They're doing the work of repairing ruptures. And it's in that space where each of them would say they have the felt sense of being seen by Jesus. When they're naming the parts of them that they hate the most that are in the room, that they have been, that the parts of them that they hate that have actually been directed at somebody else in the room. And that person says, I want more of you. And you're like only the God of the Bible does this.
Yeah.
Only the God of the Bible does this. But when he does, and when these people do this work, we will pause the situation. We will pause the experience, and we'll say, "I want each of us to pause for a moment, and I just tell me what has just happened." We all have just witnessed what's happening for multiple people, but I want you to give me a recount. Give me what's just happened for you. Tell me about this. And so we have them repeat it. And we are having them remember it. We are having them re-encode it. We're going to do this over and over and over and over again. And then we give them the assignment between now and next week. I want everybody in this room to make sure that you have taken time to, in your journal, write the screenplay for what happened in this room. I want you to write where everybody was seated. I want you to write what they were wearing. I want you to write what they said. I want you to write what you sensed when it happened. I want you to wash, rinse, repeat. I want you to do this because this is the work of the Spirit in remembering, in the same way that Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 8, 4 times says, remember, remember, remember. Do not forget the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remember. And it's that remembering, that work of having a real, episodic, embodied experience that might have lasted for 90 seconds. We like to say, it takes shame less than 3 seconds to embed itself in your memory. You don't even have to pay attention to it. Less than 3 seconds. For me to embed joy in my memory, it takes up to 90 seconds of concentrated attention, on purposeful attention. And so, this is the thing, right? Chaos is easy. Creation takes work. Yeah. I know that the work that you're doing with leaders, chaos is easy.
Yes.
But I'm sure that the work that you're doing with leaders, when you are with them in the room and you're inviting them to have these important conversations, these are not conversations that just happen like you're falling off a log.
No.
People have to do this on purpose, and it is not easy to do. But I think it's in those spaces where I know that you find people in their suffering. Yeah. And you become literally the voice, the sight line, the eye contact, the physical touch of the King.
Yeah.
And it becomes as real as it can possibly get.
Yeah.
For them to be close to the Nazarene.
Well, that is so beautiful. What a remarkable story to have been a witness to a moment like that.
Mm.
I think of the sentence in Romans 5 that talks about having gained access by faith into this grace in which we now stand. You just described what that looks like.
Mm. Yeah.
What does it look like to stand in grace, to find yourself like solid there, at home there, habituated to a place of grace?
Mm-hmm.
Is this what Paul means in part when he says to Timothy, grow in grace? I mean, is that how you grow in grace?
Yeah. Well, it's like there is a sense, like, I love Paul's language. I mean, I suppose there would be the guy had billions of words, maybe not billions, but he had a lot of words. I mean, he used them. He could have come up with some other word other than stand in grace. I'm not suggesting that he means that, but means this. But I think it is crucial for us to recognize that the notion, we talk about this when people have had trauma. And one of the rather remarkable embodied exercises that we give people to do when you have had a traumatizing event is to literally stand. We call it the Wonder Woman pose, even for dudes, right? Okay. Or you could call this. You could call it the Superman pose if you want to. We can call it the Superman pose.
Sure.
You stand. You spread your legs a little farther or just farther, right? You know this, right? Right beyond shoulder, and you put your fists on your hips, and you stand there for 3 minutes. And you pay attention to feeling your feet on the ground. You feel the weight of your body going through your legs. You feel your hands on your hips pressing in, and you will start to notice a greater sense of comfort and confidence literally in your body. You will start to notice a reduction in your sense of distress, your sense of anxiety, your physical sense of distress tends to gradually fade away. But you have to do it on purpose. Yeah. You have to do it with intention. Now, as you do this, notice you're not fighting anybody. You're not committing violence toward anyone, but you are standing with the assumption that in so doing, the very act of standing is creating a sense of comfort and confidence within us. And so for me, we say, like, my experience of grace begins with my body. When I, like, our Zoom call here turned on and I saw your face, I'm like, oh my gosh, like I could feel it in my chest. I can feel it. Like Alan Tadling is in my chest. Like, I hope it's okay with you that that's, where, the space that you occupy currently, but there is a felt sense of like you feel it first in your body. As we say, like, nothing in the world is ultimately fully yet true if I don't yet feel it in my chest. And that's where it begins, because the brain operates bottom to top and right to left. First I sense, and then I make sense of what I sense. And so even as it is a true theological concept, when Paul writes this grace in which we stand, as we say, like, everything in the Bible was written after somebody first had an embodied experience of what's being written in the Bible.
Yes.
And so I think for our listeners, one thing that I long for is I long for them to be in relationships with people in which they are having embodied experiences of what it means to stand in grace. That you could tell us, they could write in and they'd say, Alan, Curt, I remember 2 weeks ago talking with my friend John, standing in the parking lot. And he looked at me and then he just grabbed me in a hug. And that was grace. Or when we were sitting in the room and I told my story and I saw Sharon's tears. And that is, and I start to sense, I feel felt. And that is what grace is. It's not abstract, it's embodied.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
We want people to have that experience in order for them to grow on to doing the things that God longs to do with them.
I love that. Well, as I'm thinking of the Romans 5 passage that frames your book, I've long been captured by, I guess, the dynamics of what Paul says when he says, we glory in our sufferings. Why in the world will we do this? Well, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. Paul seems to know something better than a lot of us seem to know. We know this. I'm trying to know this. Can you say more about that suffering that produces perseverance, that somehow leads to character, and then this kind of solid, reliable hope that Paul has experienced and is now talking about?
Yeah. Well, yeah, this is just my reflection on it. I mean, and, for that and 25 cents, you can't really get anything in the world. And I'll say this. The first thing I would want to say is that we live in a world that is flooded with accessories. And as such, those accessories, not least of which being my phone, those accessories enable me to mitigate my suffering. Now, I know people, you know people. You've mentioned this already, people in Asia, people in other places, right? They don't have the kind of accessories in life that distract them from themselves.
Yes.
We have all kinds of distractions. And I would suggest that in the first century Rome, the first century Mediterranean life, did not hold the kind of distractions that we have. And consequently, when it came to having an encounter with the risen Jesus, the people in these communities, Paul not the least, had a clear sense of what it's like to have either Jesus or nothing. For me, I have Jesus or M&Ms, Jesus or, Instagram, Jesus or fill in the blank. And it is a constant stream that evil offers me. That is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so I say that to begin with, because I would say Paul was in a position in which if I don't have lots of accessories that I can distract myself with, then the whole notion of glory becomes really imminent and becomes a big deal. This notion of, this is where Leslie Newbigin in his treatise on John's Gospel, when he talks about John chapter 1 and focuses on the glory that we beheld, that of the only begotten of the Father. And Newbigin highlights that John's Gospel, when John talks about glory, where there are many elements of God's glory that we see throughout the arc of the biblical narrative, in John's Gospel, one of the primary ways that John is helping us to imagine glory is not just God or the glory of Jesus, of how spectacular they are, how beautiful they are, how all those things, all of which are true. Yep. But John's Gospel is focusing on this glory of two people who love each other in the way that they do. This notion that Jesus senses in himself that he is the pleasure of God. That God takes great pleasure in the presence of Jesus. That Jesus is the object of God's, and God is the object of Jesus' pleasure. Like there is this back and forth. Glorify thy Son. Meaning, love thy Son, even in the middle of crucifixion, as I have glorified you, as I've loved you, back and forth. And when then Jesus says in that text, and they will know that you are my disciples, how? Because of the way you love one another. Now, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another even as I have loved you. This sense that glory is, as C.S. Lewis likes to, writes about in his sermon, the weight of glory, this notion, he talks about, for our listeners who own dogs, and you come home to your dog and your dog loses its mind because it's so grateful that you're home and it's happy and you're happy that it's happy and so forth. And Lewis points out that the dog's delight is not just glad that you're home. It's not just because you're home. The dog's delight is primarily in your delight in the dog.
Mm.
This is how the dog is taking delight in its master's love of it. And Lewis says, like, this is our weight of glory. It is that God wants us to take delight in his delight in us. And when we talk about that kind of glory, like when you don't have, when it's either Jesus or nothing, and because you don't have anything and you contend with Jesus, you contend with somebody who loves you like that.
Mm.
If this is the glory that I'm encountering, if this is the God who doesn't leave the room, if this is the God who just keeps coming and who just keeps coming, that I can take with me into a place in which when I suffer, the glory comes with me. And I glory in my suffering. I'm not glorying because of my suffering. I'm not happy that I'm suffering. I am happy in the middle. I am being glory. I'm sensing God's glory even as I suffer. We are often. It would often be good for us to be even better Bible nerds when it comes to Jesus' comment from the cross in Matthew's gospel, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? We all are aware that those are the first lines of the 22nd Psalm, and it's easy for us to think that that's where it stops. But when you read the entire Psalm, you get to verse 19 and the whole thing turns, and the entire Psalm, the reason that he starts with, my God, why have you forsaken me, is so that he can get to the end, which is a Psalm of vindication and validation and glory. Such that even in my felt sense of being alone, I am going to keep paying attention to you paying attention to me. And this glory is then something I can live with, and it can inform my suffering. It transforms my suffering. Not to the point where I ever get to the point where it's like, oh my gosh, like I really dig suffering. Give me more of that. But rather that I become a transformed, different person in the face of it because of what the glory is doing to me in the middle of that, which then allows me to continue to persevere and build character. And out of that becomes this hope that we form, that we manufacture, that we construct. It isn't just hope then that hope happens to me or falls out of the sky and lands in my lap. It becomes a thing that my hope is not something that I form. My hope is something that we form.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love that. There's a sort of humble confidence, I think, in a hope like that.
Yeah.
And yeah, you're right. It has mostly come through the journey of discomfort and pain and loss and living those places in the presence of God along the way. And it hasn't been a hurried thing. It hasn't been a hack or a quick fix or some, 3-week magical formula, but been a long, loving obedience, I think, in the same direction.
Right. Well, I think of, as I'm just thinking about the way that we talk about even, your podcast, and I think about this notion of how we are on like unhurried living.
Yeah.
Right. And this notion that if suffering is a word that even comes into the room, by implication, we're talking about something that takes time.
Yes.
When I think about a pain that lasts for 5 seconds or even an hour, my headache.
Yeah.
I don't like the word suffering doesn't really come to mind. But once you start to extend things, right? Because we like to say that the notion of suffering is, we respond to pain over time. And I think about your unhurried living.
Mm-hmm.
And as we like to say, the things that are the most durably beautiful in the world take the longest time to create. Yeah. And to live in an unhurried way is to live necessarily at God's pace.
Yes.
And part of the challenge that I have with suffering is that I want it to be over yesterday, and hence not be suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, which really goes to the heart of your work in inviting people to live at the pace of the real world.
Yeah.
Live at the pace that we've been made to live, as you so beautifully write about, like the whole thing about anxiety. Like I need this urgency. And you're in that book, like your invitation to a pace that pauses and reflects and gives us the opportunity to be something different. I just love that. And it grounds us and prepares the way such that when suffering arrives, as it invariably will, inevitably will, we are already living at a pace that enables us to be hospitable to it.
Yeah. Yes, I resonate with that. Thank you for those reflections. Well, as we have this, I wish we could just keep talking. But as we come to our the close of our conversation, could I ask you just to share a word of encouragement in the spirit of our conversation, in the spirit of the book you've written to our listeners, most of whom, if they reflect, could easily identify a place of suffering in their present journey?
Yeah. Well, here's I've said this on occasion. I'm saying this more and more on occasion now. That the thing as human, you look around, and we as human beings, we have a pretty tough time. I have a hard time loving the people I like, let alone loving the people that I don't like, or loving the people that are my enemies. I even avoid even calling people my enemies, because then I know, like, oh, that marks them as somebody that I need to love and pray for. And I don't really want to do that. So I'll just pretend that they're not. And then Jesus can't accuse me of not praying for my enemy. I don't know what enemies. What are you? I don't know what you're talking about. And so we're not very good at loving one another. That's pretty obvious. But the reason that we have such a hard time doing that is because it's something that we're even less capable of. And we're even less capable of allowing ourselves to be loved by others. As much as that might surprise us, as much as we tell them, what do you mean? Like, well, I mean, I would love to be loved by more people, right? Until love shows up at our door, and as Jesus did, and then we tend to kill him. As I was also, a collaborator with as well. And I think this is my word of encouragement. I long for each of us, who are each of our listeners. I long for you to be curious about any part of you that believes today that there's a part of you that believes you're not wantable, a part of you that believes you're not lovable, not that you won't be, but that you aren't. Some part of you, not all of you does, not every single part of each person, but there is a part of each of us that does not believe we are wanted, does not believe we are lovable. And I want to say, I want to acknowledge that if that's the case, where that is the case, we suffer with that. We're burning energy, carrying that, keeping that part out of the, and I want to say, I want to invite you to be hospitable. Find that part of us and imagine having a conversation with that. And I will guarantee you that part of us is probably younger than 10 years old.
Yes.
And what would it be like for any of our listeners to have a conversation with that part of us that is somewhere between 10 and 3, that is suffering because they don't believe that they're wanted. They don't believe you want them. They don't believe anybody else wants them. But I want to say that to the degree that we do, you give yourself an opportunity to begin to form hope, because you're giving those parts of yourself the opportunity to be loved. And in cadence with that, I want to invite you to think of one person to whom you would be willing to consider. Now, this is not a complicated thing to do, but it might feel Herculean. One person with whom you would be willing to say to them, I would like to practice letting you love me more so that I can form hope. And I would like to practice letting you in on some things about me that not many people, maybe nobody knows, because there are parts of me that I'd really rather kill, but I need help loving them. And I wonder if you would be willing to take a risk and do that for me. And if the answer to if you're willing to do these things, I will tell you that you're taking steps toward forming hope. You're taking steps toward living into the faith of the trust of the attachment that you have to Jesus. You are creating safety. You are declaring that you are not with war with God and God is not at war with you. You are standing in the grace that you are now already in. You are giving yourself the opportunity to receive and be open to the glory that God is waiting for you to be receptive to. So that you can persevere, that you can build character, that you can become a living, breathing person of hope. And to whom others will look at and say, oh my gosh, like I want more of that, whatever she has, whatever he has, I got to get me more of that.
Well, it's my prayer that those who are listening to our conversation will take that step, will take time to reflect, take the risk of reaching to someone and ask for that sort of conversation, that kind of relationship. Well, Curt, it has been such a great treat to spend this time together. Thank you again for writing this book, The Deepest Place. I've so enjoyed our time together.
Too, Alan. Thanks so much for having me. It's great.
You've been listening to the Unhurried Living podcast. You'll find many helpful links in the show notes so you can get to know us better, as well as our partner, Life Audio, and all of their other faith-centered podcasts. Join us next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus's unhurried way of life and leadership.